Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm Gouwah Solomon, and stay with us as we take you through a very, very concerning topic which we didn't quite realize it was quite an interesting and concern here in South Africa, and that is malnutrition. In studio, we have a pediatrician, Dr. Fatima Khan, based out at the Victoria Hospital in Western Cape Town. Assalamu alaikum to you, doctor. Thank you so much for joining us in our Cape Town studio.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran so much for having us. And like you said, it's quite a big talk that we are having.
Yes.
And not just an issue that's in South Africa, but an issue that is globally a problem. And yes, it's always great to see a problem that is happening at our grassroots that is affecting us so greatly, but also just to see how it affects the rest of the world and how the world is affected by this and what repercussions and what issues it has as a long-term effect. And malnutrition has become... The world has been progressing, but malnutrition has not been progressing. And it's a massive problem, not just in South Africa, not just in Africa, but the other parts of South America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Australia as well.
So let's get into this topic and understand that we might be cozy and or comfortable at our homes and not realizing literally our neighbor or just even 10 kilometers away, there are children born with that are malnourished. Let's quickly understand, what does this word malnutrition, malnourish mean?
So in simple terms, it's a poor diet, poor nutrition. And malnutrition encompasses both being underweight or undernutrition, which is stunting, wasting, undernutrition, as well as vital vitamins and mineral deficiency, and as well as looking at the other part where we don't always realize, but being overnutrition. So overnutrition is also part of malnutrition if you look at the big scale of obesity. And this, as much as malnutrition as being underweight and severe acute malnutrition is affecting us, obesity is steadily on the incline throughout South Africa, Africa, and the rest of the world. And to think about the repercussions that happen with that. So heart disease, renal disease, cardiovascular, we see all of those that our adult population is seeing, and this is coming through in our children, in our pediatric population as well. So nutrition on its own doesn't always encompass that severely acute malnourished, which we do see quite a few of, but also looking at overnutrition as well.
Okay, so it falls into both categories, malnutrition. And now specifically in hoping that we can focus on the first 1,000 days, the critical 1,000 days of life, and that's where change can happen. With malnutrition, understanding the possible causes that does relate to it.
So the big causes, and we always look at this, and I'm happy that you're mentioning the first 1,000 days, because what is, when you look at malnutrition, it starts from the conception of that little baby, of that embryo and sperm matching. And one of the big causes is undernutrition in our mothers. So poor nutrition, maternal nutrition, causing children to be underweight. And if you look at our South African data on its own, looks at 15% of children born underweight for age. And that on its own has repercussions. So children who are born underweight, then having the risk of being malnourished, and has a higher risk of being obese later on in life. And then we look at things as our poor diet. What do we have that's available to us that can be sustainable? We look at going to the shops, and it is we're hoping to get fortified foods. And what does that mean? Bread that has iron, that's iron rich, cereal that's iron rich. But with a big part of socioeconomic status of our country, where we see affordability decreasing massively. I mean, we look at the interest rates and people talking about prime minus this, prime, and it really has a massive effect. Why? Because as South Africans, we have a big part of low income communities and middle income communities. And those are the communities that actually struggle. And it makes up a big part of our population. And then one other big cause that we do see is war and conflict. And we might think about it as, what is war and conflict in the scheme of South Africa? I mean, if we look at what's happening in Manenberg this week, there's been mass shootings. You look at all of what's happening in other rural parts as well, fighting over land, fighting over all of this. And then we look at this globally, and we look at what's happening in Syria, in Yemen. We look at Sudan with conflict, with drought, and everything else happening. We have a very big vulnerable population that is at risk of malnutrition. So just going back at it, it's poor diet, poor maternal health, socioeconomics, where poverty is massive, and then looking at war and conflict. And I'd add number 5, because what has COVID really done to our country? What has COVID done to the world? And if you just take South Africa as an example, where how many people have lost their jobs, how much of our healthcare services was lost during that time. We now pick up children who are not vaccinated, children who were lost to being picked up and being monitored for HIV. So children who were born to HIV mothers, where they weren't tested at the right times. And you now have a population where HIV has become a big thing. And with all of those, the repercussions of other chronic diseases, chronic illnesses that are then picked up. So COVID has had this massive effect, not just on, again, South Africa, but the rest of the world. And what we've been seeing is that everything has this knock-on effect, where it's the one thing that leads to the next thing, that leads to the next thing.
Down.
And we'll get into where we go down the route of what are the actual complications of all of this.
Yeah, because there are many. And looking at children that are also born early, preemie babies would exacerbate the cause as well, but not necessarily the main cause. But understanding the symptoms and the signs to watch out for, because sometimes there could be an issue around a child being malnourished in not necessarily a lower to middle class family, but yet they're being malnourished because of poor diet or for whatever reason. So what are some of the signs and symptoms that we as moms can watch out for and can see possibly in our helpers or people that is working around us?
Oh, I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because what do we deal with as seeing all the time is it's our picky eaters. And sometimes we think picky eaters, but they get some fruit and they get some of this, but is it enough? And for our population, we do see picky eaters as one of the causes of malnutrition. And what do we have to look out for us, but also for children who maybe it's the neighbor's little child or someone else's little child. And sometimes it is, and that's why it's also so important that we do follow up with our clinic visits and all of those things, because it's not always that you're going to have a tape measure and a scale to actually, but what can you physically see? So the part that goes with malnutrition is all those micronutrient deficiencies and your zinc and your iron and your calcium and stuff that are low. So a lot of the time you'll see kids have sparse hair. They also have lightening of their hair, because they lose all those nutrients, and that's like one of the first things. You'll also see where they'll have skin that would slough off. So because they have zinc deficiencies and vitamin E deficiencies, they also slough off. One big sign, and I mean in our affluent populations where we do see kids who bruise easily and we always think of cancers, and so those are one of the signs of actual malnutrition, where they have big, massive bruises on their body. And a lot of the time in hospitals, they're brought in as query being abused at home, and there's nothing like that. It's actually just because the cycle of what is happening with malnutrition is that your albumin and protein production is low, and your liver doesn't work. So you then end up having your fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K, which are all part of like clotting factors and stuff that gets depleted in the body. So a lot of times you'll see signs of bruising on the child, bleeding gums, poor dental hygiene, also like kids, and I'm not saying now we must all go out and go, oh, that child with the bowed legs probably has malnutrition, but it is something that can be a long-term sign that you do see. It's kids with bony deformities, and that's because their calcium levels are not great in their blood and stuff. So we do look at those signs. We also look at muscle bulk. So you'll see kids
Losing
with
muscle.
skinny arms, skinny legs. That is quite concerning as well. So there's lots of signs that you would see. And from a doctor's point of view, there's other signs that you'll pick up. So sometimes you can feel their liver in their tummy because it also gets big, because it becomes fatty. Their heart starts to get big because it becomes fatty. The muscle becomes almost fatty. So it's those changes that you'll also see.
Wow.
But for us, as if we're just home looking out for what the issues and what symptoms we're going to see, it's all those skin and hair symptoms that would be most obvious.
Most visible. Okay. We're chatting to Dr. Fatima Khan in studio with us, a pediatrician at the Victoria Public Hospital here in the Western Cape. Health and wellness, more questions around malnutrition just after the short break. Don't forget to interact with us via our social media pages if you have any questions on this topic, but don't go anywhere. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another edition of Health and Wellness, as we take you through some of the important facts when you don't quite understand why your child is getting bruises, possibly changing of hair color all of a sudden, the skin is a bit sagging. Dr. Fatima Khan is taking us through some other signs and symptoms and how we can work through malnutrition when it comes to our little ones and even sometimes in adults possibly. But a pediatrician is in studio with us, a specialist child doctor. And I know, adults is not necessarily your forte, but is there some of the signs and symptoms that could possibly be picked up in adults?
Yes, of course. The one thing that goes with it is chronic disease as well. Okay. And we see it from diabetes, which can lead to malnutrition because of the insulin and glucose instabilities. And malnutrition across, like even our moms, where they have low BMIs because of poor intake. So what does all mothers do? They see to the kids and the husband first, and they're last to eat when it comes to that. But they are breastfeeding a child. There's 2 children at school. There's another one on its way. And you don't realize what impact and energy that uses. And one example I love using is that it takes, to breastfeed a child is equivalent to running a half marathon every day. So you can just imagine what energy requirement it is for a mom. And I focus on the mom because it comes back to that first 1,000 days again, where you need a strong mother, a healthy mother, to keep that pregnancy going. And that first 1,000 days starts in the first trimester of pregnancy already. And for that embryo and fetus to then grow, it relies solely on the maternal nutrition. So whatever's coming via the placenta to that baby is of utmost importance. But a mother who's living on tea and water and bread is not going to be enough. And if you think of the bigger Africa, where you do see drought and famine, and that's happening, is they live on very little. And that again has the repercussion of then having a low birth baby, which we have seen. And now the mother again needs energy to breastfeed this baby for at least 6 months.
Not getting the proper nutrition.
Exactly that. So now, yes, we still say that even though the mother is malnourished, that breast milk is still great breast milk because it comes with everything else, the antibodies and all the fighting factors. That is great still. It might not be as great as someone who can have a full diet and and that's why the repercussion would then be small mommy, small baby, or undernourished mother, undernourished child, and getting them through those parts. And yes, we do see adult men that are malnourished as well. And you generally physically see it where they have poor muscle bulk. They have temporal wasting because they start losing muscle. And that's the sad part, is that once you have that muscle wasting, and a lot of it then gets associated with other chronic diseases that has its own stigmas attached to it. So yes, we do see it in adults. But I think why it's such a big thing when it comes to children is because of the complications and where it then leads to in the long term.
This is only the start of their life now.
Exactly.
And they need to start good on a good footing and foundation.
And I think this is a great opportunity to speak about the complications then that goes with malnutrition. And yes, we see the acute complications where we do see they come in with hypoglycemias, meaning their sugars are low.
Okay.
Why? Because their liver is not working. So the glucose storage and glucose production that happens in the liver doesn't really happen. And you are not feeding.
Yeah.
So there's a double whammy when it comes to low glucose. Hypothermia. So they are cold. Because their core temperatures can't regulate. They have little fat stores, little muscle stores, so then they're unable to, and then we see high risk for infections, electrolyte disturbances that can then have its own issues of having seizures, having low calcium, low magnesium, all muscle issues as well. And those are all the acute things that we need to also manage acutely, because if you don't get through those first 24 hours, it can have severe knock-on effects and even lead to death.
This is 24 hours of when the baby's born.
Oh, we're looking at 24 hours of noting that the child is severely, acutely malnourished.
And from the symptoms that you've picked up, that you are then able to make the necessary diagnosis?
So the diagnosis is made on measurements.
Okay.
So what are our measurements that we need? So we look at weight for height. So we generally say weight for height. So we have standard deviations, and it is where does our population grow? Okay. So you'll see in your adult cards, and if you have kids, their clinic books that they get, and there's a green line that is the 0 line, and that is the perfect line to be growing on. And then there's one line below that is the -2 standard deviation. And for weight for height, it means that your height and your weight is low. And then -3 standard deviation. And that's where you say it's severe acute malnutrition, that this child is wasted now, right? And then the other good parameter to use is your mid-upper arm circumference. And we generally say a mid-upper arm circumference of less than 11 centimeters. So you can imagine what 11 centimeters.
Oh my goodness.
And that parameter is used for an age group from till 5 years old, right? So you can't do it in a child that's under 1. You have to be 1 and above, and you do this mid-upper arm circumference. But if it's less than 11 centimeters, you're malnourished. And then the third sign that kind of puts everything together is if you have edema. So edema is like where your tissues then leak, and I don't know if you've seen it in old people who has heart failure. They have swelling of their legs.
Yes.
So children get that, and that's generally because their protein and their albumin is low, and everything leaks out of the out into the capillaries and out into the skin.
And it swells at the bottom.
It swells, and if you think of that, everything moves from the inside out. So there's also repercussions of those things. So
is that one of the reasons why you see these kids in Africa, in malnourished areas with the big bellies? You often see that happen.
Yes. So that's exactly. And back in the day, we used to speak about marasmus and kwashiorkor, and those terms were used quite readily. So marasmus was the little big belly with the thin legs and the thin arms. You'd see that. And the kwashiorkor one is where people say, no, but look how fat that child is. But it's not really fat. It's actually water. Right? Or now we would say water, capillaries that are leaking. So they have that swollen legs,
and it
swollen
actually does
face.
look like that swollen look, not the fat look.
Exactly.
Fat,
And they actually have sloughing of their skin, and the skin breaks off and stuff. So it's really not a nice picture to see. So yes, those are the extreme forms that we do see as well.
And how common is that here in South Africa? I mean, you're working in the public sector, not necessarily rural per se, but have you been out to some areas that,
I mean, we haven't been far. I see it in my hospital quite often, and I must be honest, when I worked in the Eastern Cape, we'd see it a little bit more often because the rural areas were around. And I must be honest that since COVID, we've picked up so many malnourished children. So we see that because of this, the effects of people not working, no access to healthcare, schools that were closed. Because you must remember, a big part of our population gets their breakfasts, gets their lunches at school. And now you're in a household where mom and dad's not working. And where do you get food? So yes, we have been seeing it a lot more in recent months.
Let's talk about the issue around breastfeeding and moms that are told, and I don't know how far our technology is, or how progressive we are with regards to AIDS and moms breastfeeding their babies, because I think a lot is still unknown to the world as far as where South Africa is at, and their AIDS and pregnant moms that has AIDS and breastfeeding them.
So again, we do have a large prevalence of HIV positive moms, and what the big what we want to create is a safe environment for our moms, because as we know it, HIV has its own stigma attached to it. You're going in at that door at the clinic because that's where the HIV moms get treated, and a lot of the moms then end up not wanting to go to that clinic or not wanting to seek help because people will know that they have the disease. And what is it associated with is that we all know, oh, it's sexually transmitted, they've been having risky behaviors, and we all know that's not entirely true. I mean, it's like we look at any other chronic disease. And yes, we have advanced massively when it has come to the treatment of HIV, but it still has that underlying issue of the adherence and compliance to the medication is up to the mom. So for someone to take the pill, they have to physically take it. It's like the saying, you can take the horse to the water, but you can't let it
drink.
Exactly. That's what comes to the pill. I can hand out the tablets to every HIV mom, but it's still up to that mom to take it. And again, the insight of why the importance, counseling is so important when it comes to that. And we do have high risk pregnancies. And what we mean by high risk is where the mother is not virally suppressed. So they do have a high viral load. And once your viral load for HIV is high, there's the likely of transferring it to your baby during the delivery process or breastfeeding is high. But there's also been an advancement there where children go on to prophylaxis, so preventative. But it's not 100% proof, fail proof. Like there's still a chance of getting it. So, and that's why testing and things are so important, and regular testing. And there's a whole program on when things must be tested and why, at what certain ages are done. But again, we see that back about maybe 10 years ago, they did look at saying, don't breastfeed because you have a risk of transmitting to the child. But I think that misnomer came in where mothers were not virally suppressed. And now that we have such great treatment available, moms are virally suppressed, babies goes on to prophylaxis, and they get that great benefit of breastfeeding. And I think our message out there is always that breast is best.
Okay, when we come back with you, Dr. Fatima, shukran so much. When we come back, more on malnutrition and how we can take this big pandemic, possibly here in South Africa and in Africa, to a new heights in our local environments and communities. But we talk more on how we can possibly look forward to solving malnutrition if it is in your home or in your neighbors 10 kilometers away from you without even knowing. Start a community food project. Who knows? That might solve a little bit of a problem when it comes to malnutrition. More just after the short break. Back in a moment. Welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. A very good day to you wherever you are. And remember, if you've missed any of our shows, you can watch it on our YouTube uploads the next day. And also, if anyone's watching it right now, you can tell your family, friends, and colleagues across the lands and over the beautiful oceans. They can do so on www.hilaal.tv. I'm Gouwah Solomon. Stay with me as we still cover the topic of malnutrition with Dr. Fatima Khan, pediatrician here in the Western Cape Victoria Hospital. So, how do we treat malnutrition? And I know we have to look at different aspects of communities or our surroundings, what is available to us. I've been at, when I've had my kids sitting at the clinic, just a simple thing like giving your child peanut butter and bread with a glass of milk was a way of, getting a certain amount of nutrition in, which I found was amazing. And some of our maybe underprivileged or smaller communities or rural areas, that information is not necessarily filtered through. So how do we treat malnutrition before we can prevent it?
It's a very broad question because again, the treatment comes into, and I always look at treatment as what is our acute treatment and what is our chronic treatment, because with everything, there are the acute things that needs to be treated immediately, and those are the medical emergencies that come with it. And I think just to highlight it quickly, it's that when we treat severe acute malnutrition, we look at the World Health Organization 10 steps, and that's the big management of treating malnutrition and the acute phase, but it also has the chronic part of the treatment as well. So the acute things, again, just quickly running through them, I don't think that's going to be the focus of this now because that's more in hospital, but we'll talk a bit about the discharge and rehabilitation phase, which I think is an important topic. But quickly just to go through the acute things is those hypoglycemias, the low sugars, hypothermia, heating up the child properly, infections, micro and macronutrient deficiencies, and correcting all of those things. But the longer outcomes is knowing that you have a malnourished child, and it's how to get that slow feeding and catch-up feeding, which is quite important. And also then, and yes, we do have the nutritional programs out in the communities where we are grateful that there's government subsidized porridges and milk that are available and ready to eat nutrition. So the right type of thing that, and exactly what you were saying is peanut butter that they used to do in sachets, and I think it has about, correct me, but it's about 500 calories in one sachet of peanut butter, and that has become quite changing in the scheme of. But again, how many of these people have access to fetching? And there's always another issue on an issue and whatever else. And then looking at the rehabilitation where it comes to a lot of our kids lose the ability to be able to sit, to be able to walk, to be able to talk, and all of those things as a complication of malnutrition. Because you must remember, you're losing muscle, you're losing nutrients, your brain atrophies, all of those things. And we don't think about the complications being that big. We think, oh, they didn't eat, they're starving, that's okay, we feed them. But it's actually a bigger picture than that. It's about getting the balances right. And sometimes when we do start refeeding children who've been starved per se, no food, there are complications with feeding them as well. So it's lots of like small little things that we have to think about. But also the importance of rehabilitation afterwards. And that is getting physio to help strengthen muscles again, getting the occupational therapists involved with play therapy and teaching children to play again because they lose all that ability. We have children who ends up unable to sit after being severely malnourished. And then the long-term things of refeeding, making sure that the dietitian knows about them so that there is counting of calories, or not as in a diet, but making sure they get sufficient calories to actually catch up with all of those. And then the long-term complications of where does this child end up? Because we don't we also tend to forget the effects it has on our children's brains. And that's why I'm saying treatment in terms of having a good, and how much of this is actually available in the communities is where they have this rehabilitation in forms of play, in forms of sensory stimulation and all of that, because it affects their long-term outcomes with going to school. And to avoid having school issues later on in life, because what does it actually lead to?
And this is still the early years of their lives.
Exactly.
And can that then possibly be corrected within that early years, or somewhat helped or assisted?
So early identification, early treatment, and hoping to get that proper stimulation. But it is the vicious cycle. As terrible as it sounds, in our poorer communities, in bigger parts of Africa, in bigger parts, and where it comes into that cycle of malnourished children, poor rehabilitation, poor schooling, not finishing schooling, being uneducated, poverty, and more poverty, all of those things. So we sit again with this vicious cycle. And the question then is, how do we break the cycle? It's not that malnutrition is something that started yesterday, but it's such an ongoing problem with trying to break the cycle.
So how do we try and fix it? I know that there's lots of preventative methods. We can go on WHO, and we can, join a community and, feeding scheme. But for us to start today, how can we possibly help in our little small way to prevent it? Also, sometimes in our homes, if we have an issue, and I know this is a global solution that we have to sort of look at. But in our homes, to start there globally, to look at it from our neighbor to 10 kilometers away, to actually find out if our own children are possibly malnourished.
And that's just it. We mustn't think that what we're doing is too little. And I think every little bit counts when it comes to helping.
Yeah.
And sometimes, yes, it is great to say, okay, what's happening in Cape Town before we look at South Africa? And what's happening in South Africa before we look at Africa? What's happening in Africa before we look at the world? And it's about looking at what is happening in your household. Okay. So is it our kids go to school, they are exposed to other children at school. Mommy, little Iman doesn't have lunch to school today.
Okay.
Simple. Can we have that there are school programs in place, whether it is funded by the kids going to the school, by a school, that there are meals available at school. Again, we do have little things happening at the clinics, again, with visits to the clinics, but we have to look at sustainable things. Yeah. It is, I can honestly say that people are embarrassed that they don't have. No, you won't find, everyone thinks their neighbor is fine. We're all living in the same area. I work, they should be fine. We never worry about, is our neighbor okay? Right next door, and
because we're living a certain way, they're also living that way.
Because they're our neighbor.
Actually, I watched a documentary, not even a documentary, it was a sitcom of some sort, a medical show, and some ER, and then they were treating this old lady who was living in a sort of a complex with other elderly individuals, and it was sort of a upmarket type of more affordable people that could really afford to live in a certain way. And this woman had come in with something, and then they found out that she was malnourished, and she was dressed well, she had on makeup, she was looked all good, like she was from the top shelf. And her friends came in to visit her, and the more the doctors were trying to say, what are you eating? What are you? And the doctors picked it up. They were something like she was eating cat food or something like that, because she thought that would be okay for her to eat, because that was the only thing she could afford. But in the meantime, the rest of the neighbors couldn't even, she was too embarrassed, the whole point of being embarrassed. So we need to knock on our doors. We need to, even if we think that this person is okay, or that they possibly just living like we are, would be okay. But the question also arises within our homes. Yes, fine, our children might not be malnourished, but are we giving our kids, our children, let's say our sisters' children, and not to pick in and nitpick at anybody else's life, but just to sort of help the cycle? What conversations could we be starting within our own circles?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to us thinking spoiling our children is a good thing. And now we're bringing it back home to what's more realistic for us.
Yeah.
And how many times do we go to our sister's home and we end up buying the chips and the sweets and the chocolates and this, and getting, because that's what
normal,
looks at normal. But how great isn't it if we then end up taking healthier options?
There we go.
And how do we get those healthy options across? Fruit is an amazing source of, like you mentioned earlier, peanut butter and crackers is an amazing source
And some
of
kids
having
love peanut butter.
avocado. Again, yes, okay, it's quite an expensive thing to have, but it's such a great.
Start something,
But all those small little things that can add up to a bigger, and it's just making that little bit that you put in count in a nutritious way.
And there's so much more that can be said, Doc. I just want you to quickly wrap up in 30 seconds your last words as you leave us with the understanding that malnutrition is not just out there.
I think the one thing is, and I think you've highlighted it nicely, is don't ever assume that always ask, and every little bit that you can help with helps, and it counts at the end of the day. There's always and I mean, even if it's just walking out of your community a little bit and seeing what's happening in that surrounding area, and you thinking, oh, but it's my kids' old clothes, or it's this or whatever. It does go far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fatima.